Hi, everybody. Hi, Henry.
Hi, guys.
Welcome to the Presidential Report Card. Today we'll be discussing Gerald Ford and what grade he should receive for a short time in office.
Yep. We'll be going over 4 different categories to grade him on, which would be Chief Legislator, Chief Executive, Commander in Chief, and the Chief of State. Evan, for the people who don't know, who is Gerald Ford?
Gerald Ford was the 38th President of the United States, and he served from 1974 to 77. He was the first president to never be elected into either the presidency or vice presidency. He took office after the resignation of Richard Nixon due to the Watergate scandal, and he took vice presidency after Nixon's vice president also resigned due to the Watergate scandal.
Yep. He came into politics in 1948 when he beat the Michigan's 5th Congressional District in a crucial debate to make him Public Work Committee. In 1951, he moved to the House of Appropriations Committee, which which also led to him gaining influence in the subcommittee Defense Appropriations.
All right, now that we have a good idea of who Ford is, I want to talk about his roles that he took as president. And I said we are going to be going over Ford. So, Henry, what's the first one?
We could start with chief legislator. So the chief legislator is responsible for like proposing and passing laws, as well as overseeing the legislative process. And they also have the power to veto laws that have been passed by the legislator. The chief legislator is the ultimate authority in the legislative branch and is the face of the government to the public.
During his time in office, Gerald Ford he was the chief legislator. Obviously, he was responsible for introducing bills to Congress and working with Congress to pass legislation. Ford was a strong advocate for fiscal responsibility, and he worked to reduce government spending and balance the budget. He also sought to reduce the size of the government and increase efficiency in the government.
Ford was a strong proponent of civil rights and worked to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, which would have granted equal rights to women. He also worked to pass the Education Amendment of 1975, which, if you don't know, provided federal aid to students in need and increased the federal government's role in education. Ford also worked to pass the Freedom of Information Act, which allowed citizens to access government documents.
Ford strongly approved environmental protection, and he worked to pass the Endangered Species Act of 1973. This provided protection for endangered species around the United States. He also worked to pass the Clean Air Act of 77, which set standards for air quality and sought to reduce air pollution. So Ford was a big guy on the environmental side, uh, which helped him gain a large following among the people because at the time global warming was starting to become a thing.
Yep. Ford was definitely a strong supporter of foreign policy and worked to pass the Helsinki Accords, which sought to improve like relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. He worked to pass the Panama Canal Treaty, which obviously returned control of the canal to Panama.
So not only did Ford enjoy the environment, he also enjoyed other foreign countries and he respected them. Overall, we think that Gerald Ford is a strong advocate for fiscal responsibility, civil rights, environmental protection, and foreign policy. He worked to pass a number of important bills during his time in office, and his legacy as chief legislator is still felt today. This means that we think he deserves. This means that I personally think he deserves around a B.
Yeah, I'd probably agree with that. He was pretty average when fulfilling his role as chief legislator. Um, a B is a bit harsh, but I personally think he deserves like a B plus.
I'll agree with you on this one. And I'll settle. So finally, we think that we're for chief legislator role we're going to give Ford a B plus. This brings us on to our next topic, the chief of state. The chief of state in the United States is the president is the president. Obviously, he's responsible for greeting members and people as the head of the United States. They're responsible for talking to different countries in the name of America. This role of the president also means that they have to look over the country in times of need.
Overall, we think that Ford was pretty successful as the chief of state. He assumed presidency in the wake of the Watergate scandal, and immediately he set about restoring trust in the government by issuing a full pardon to Nixon.
Yeah. This was met a lot of ways. One of the ways was let's move on, let's trust the government again. And the other way was, well, Nixon committed crimes. What are you doing just letting him off the hook? So
Hmm.
there's a lot of mixed reactions to this one. He also advocated for a policy of national reconciliation to heal the country's divide.
His background as a long serving congressman and reputation as a moderate helped him to work effectively with both parties in Congress to pass important legislation. This is obviously like a big advantage for a president to be able to work with both parties.
Hmm.
He had pragmatic approach to foreign policy, um, which helped to ease tensions with the Soviet Union and also helped to establish a more stable um, international environment.
The last point is that we have is he worked to improve the economy, which was struggling heavily at the time, and he addressed the foreign policy changes, including the Vietnam War and the Cold War with the Soviet Union.
Yep. So, to give him a final grade on this, I think that we can both agree it should be somewhere in the C range. Um, Even though he wasn't too successful in giving a successful pardon to Nixon and what the past administration had done with the Watergate scandal, um, this overall kind of damaged his image in the eyes of the people. Ford went to Congress to get them to drop charges against Nixon. In my eyes, this definitely wasn't appropriate for a president to do because um, what they say and their actions have so much impact on on and power that you can't just excuse a person that broke the laws like that.
Even as that is, I think Ford also had a lot of good motives and moves as a president. He was given a country with a failing economy and an impeached president before him, and he tried his best with what he was given. So I personally would give him around a B range. Uh, I think he was successful, and his intentions helped ease tensions with people in the country and other countries like the Soviet Union. Giving an average of the two ratings we gave Ford, I think our final grade would be a C plus.
Okay, that seems fair. Okay, so our next point we want to talk about is the commander in chief. So the commander in chief, their role is basically as the president, they're to control the armed forces of the United States, um, either currently at war or out of war. In our case, we were in war, the Vietnam War and the Cold War when Gerald Ford was president.
On that note, I think that we should talk about Ford's impact on the Vietnam and Cold War. When we were fighting Vietnam, Ford made a very risky decision and decided to pull our troops instead of fighting even more and sending the conflict into a full force war. Because at the time it was named as a conflict.
Yeah, this caused a lot of like turmoil, you could say, in the U.S. Many people were upset with what he had done. In their eyes, he like wasted our resources and lost the innocent lives of soldiers. On the other hand, some people wanted to see the violence stop. Many innocent lives have been lost, and there would be many lost in the future to come. So it's like what happened recently with Biden in Afghanistan when he pulled out the troops.
Yeah, there's a lot of because everybody you might not know about the Vietnam thing because it was a bit past our time, but you can obviously tell about the uh, Biden Afghanistan thing. You hear people complaining all the time about like we sorry about that. You hear people complaining about that all the time about giving them troops. You also hear people congratulating it because less people would die in the end. There are a few cons that Gerald Ford had as a chief of state. He was criticized for his handling of the Vietnam War and his refusal to send additional troops, and instead he sought to negotiate the peace agreement that led to the fall of South Vietnam in 1975.
So, criticized for his handling of the economy as his conservative policies, such as cutting taxes for the wealthy and cutting government spending, led to a period of high inflation and a lot of unemployment.
He was also criticized for his handling of foreign policy, which has been seen as too soft on the Soviet Union and too willing to negotiate with them, which led to a period of increased tensions between the two countries.
Yep. He had a few pros as well, though. Ford was a strong advocate for civil rights. He signed the Education Amendments in 1975, which prohibited discrimination in education based on sex, race, national origin. Um, he also signed the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which prohibited discrimination in credit transactions.
Ford was a strong supporter of the government. He signed the Endangered Species Act of 73, which provided protection for all endangered species and their habitats. He also signed the Clean Air Act of 1975, which set standard quality for air and emissions. So while he was trying to help the environment, I don't think there's anybody in the country, there's probably one or two, that would get mad at him for this and that would like put him down for this
Yep.
because and he's just trying to help everybody.
Well, as well as being a strong supporter of the environment, he was definitely a strong supporter of the military. He increased military spending and increased the size of the armed forces. He also signed the Arms Control Disarm,
Disarmament.
Disarmament Act of 1975, which sought to reduce the number of nuclear weapons in the world.
Yeah. I think that Ford was just trying to help people, and I think that he was trying to stop the violence. People give him hate for pulling troops and coming to like peace treaties, but it saved lives in the end, and I think that's all that really matters.
Hmm.
We decided his grade beforehand, and we're gonna give Ford a solid A minus,
A
91%.
minus. Yeah. Yeah,
The
I would agree with that.
last and final segment we're gonna talk about is Gerald Ford's performance as a chief executive. The chief executive is the president supervising the work of different departments in the government. They also hire people with help from the Senate. They also hire executives to run the department in the government. Here are pros to Gerald Ford's time as the chief executive.
So, a few pros. He was a unifying figure. Ford was able to bring the country together after the Watergate scandal and the Vietnam War. He was definitely able to restore faith in the government and the presidency, and he was able to bring the country together in a time of great division.
Uh, I agree. Yeah, I think that what he did helped, and the way he did it was very professional. He was a strong leader. Ford was a leader who was able to make tough decisions and stand up for what he believed in, such as pulling troops. And he was also able to make other difficult decisions like pardoning Nixon, which was unpopular at the time, but necessary for the country to move on and to trust the government again.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It was definitely necessary. Um, so another thing was he was a fiscal conservative. Ford was a fiscal conservative who was able to reduce government spending and balance the budget. He was able to reduce the size of the government and reduce the deficit. It wasn't, however,
Sorry.
sorry. It wasn't, however, all good. There was bad parts of Ford's time as chief executive.
Sorry. Well, Ford was unable to end the Vietnam War, despite his efforts. He was unable to, right? He was able to negotiate a ceasefire, but the war continued until the end of his presidency, which on top of like he pulled troops and then he couldn't even end the war. He received a lot of backlash for that one.
Yeah, you could definitely see why there's backlash for that one because he didn't win the war, he didn't end the war, he just pulled out troops. So he was also unable to revive the economy. Ford was unable to revive the economy during his time in office. The economy was a recession when he took office, and it continued to struggle throughout his presidency.
Um, Last point was Ford was unable to pass major legislation. He wasn't able to pass any major legislation during his time in office, and he was unable to pass any of his major initiatives that he started, such as the WIN program, which is, if you don't know, the Whip Inflation Now program to get inflation down. Kind of failed with his big moves.
Yeah, so taking that all into like consideration, I would say that we should give him like a high B, like B plus. This is because he did more good than bad, and he definitely ended up helping the United States.
I know we said that this was a final segment, and I'm sorry for that, but there's one more that we forgot to go over. The question we've been trying to answer this entire time: was Gerald Ford an imperialistic president?
Um, I I don't think that Gerald Ford was an imperialistic president. He didn't have a record of expanding the United States' power or influence through colonization or military conquest, which is associated with imperialistic policies.
Yeah, I agree. He didn't really. There's nothing to tie him to any imperialistic policies. And Ford's foreign policy focused on maintaining stability and order in the world, and his main focus was on diplomacy and negotiations, which is rather than expansionism, which is kind of the opposite of imperialism. Uh, right?
Yeah.
Um, President Carter, the president that came after him, that beat him in the re-election, said to him, "For myself and our nation, I want to thank my pres- predecessor for all that he has done to heal our land." And I think that this quote really speaks to people because it shows them that Ford wasn't given much, but he made the best of it, right? And he did what he could.
Yep. Totally agree. And so that was the end of our final segment, and that's all we have right now. So thank you all for listening in today, and hope you learned a lot about Gerald Ford. Have a good one. Bless you.
Thank you.